Greetings, friends. Wanangruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine update for the weeks of July 6th through July 19th of 2026. And today we're going to be starting in a new direction. Well, I've renamed it to the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk Fortress City direction. Basically, this combines the Konstantinovka and Slavyansk direction, so everything from the Savetsky River down to the Konstantinovka area here. This is what I'm talking about, the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk Fortress areas, because this week we are basically, I mean, obviously the battles for these cities haven't started yet, but basically we are getting to the point where we're starting to see Russian actions to start shaping the battle that is to come for the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk Fortress Belt, which is, as they mentioned, as I hear my name here, it's basically what they call the Fortress Belts of the Donbass, and this is the where the main defense for the Donbass is. That doesn't mean that once they capture this, that there's just clean walk for the rest of it. It's just that these are like where the Ukrainians have stationed their biggest, the most amount of built up areas where a lot of their troops are. It's a huge built up area, so it's a great place to have a logistics center, comm center, just a fighting center, and yeah, and if that falls, then basically Donbass is basically gone for the Ukrainians. So the battle for these fortress city is basically ongoing. And right now, the biggest news, the reason why I'm starting here is because in the last 2 weeks during the first part of July, the Russians are expanding their bridgehead on the other side of the canal here and are just slowly but surely getting closer and closer to Kramatorsk. We're only like 6 kilometers away from Kramatorsk now. We had, for example, we had of geolocation of the Russians being in the town of Veselnivska here, for example. And some other sources are saying also the Russians have infiltrated Peromorovka, though we haven't had a video source of that. But obviously, if they're infiltrating this much where they're getting bombed, they're probably also infiltrating here. My guess is probably what they want to do is infiltrate through these villages into this area of Kramatorsk. You want to try to get into the most built up areas as possible, kind of move your way through these whatever buildings there are. You don't want to just go straight across these open fields here because you'd be struck by the Ukrainian drone operators that probably operate out of this industrial zone probably. So, but in any case, obviously that doesn't mean they're like, oh, consolidating here. It just means there's operations. But it does show that, and most mappers are now reflecting this, that the towns of Malinivka and Tikhonivka, and this kind of small bridgehead that's developing here. Before we talked about, yes, the Russians have claimed the capture, but this time most mappers are now getting around to getting their sources saying, yes, there's now a bridgehead. And it's not just, oh, there's DRGs operating on the other side of the canal. We're not talking about a more established presence for the Russians here, which is very good news. I always thought they wouldn't attack Kramatorsk directly, but who knows? Maybe they are going to do that. But I do think that right now this is just to expand to create a more solid, defense pile. And I think the main operations will be towards Mykolaievka, because this is one of the main keys and the gateway to Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, because it's a huge town that the Russians can use to put drone operators, and from Mykolaievka, drone operators have free will to start cutting off everything in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and turning them into ghost cities. And it'll be, it'll be a very good place to put troops here, along with in Lyman. But yeah, there's that happening. And also what's happening is the Russians are just slowly but surely clearing up the kind of these. We talked about it before, how these kind of areas between Krylovka and Kalinivka, this area between Real Alexandrivka and Nikiforivka, like this area was being like still had Ukrainian defenders, but like kind of cut off, or maybe the Russians. And I mentioned how the Russians probably just try to bypass them, but it seems like now these pockets are just slowly under Russian control, just slowly but surely. These pockets that have been like just around or just slowly but surely being taken. Right now the Russians are not battling for this forest area right here. The Russians Russians probably are trying to clear up, just slowly but surely, just getting the front line ready for a strike on Mykolaievka. What I think is going to happen is the Russians are going to push along the Savetsky-Donetsk River, uh, along towards Starodubovka, and then try to start entering the Slavyansk power plant, kind of move along the Savetsky-Donetsk River here. Well, right now, it's probably being what's complicating that is the Ukrainians are still resisting in Lyman, and justly so, because losing Lyman would be a very big setback for the Ukrainians defending Slavyansk. It's all interconnected. It's not like these, but another big thing that the fall of Lyman and thus the Russians pushing the Ukrainians on the other side of the Savetsky-Donetsk River will bring is that it will make it a lot easier for the Russians to infiltrate Mykolaievka like that. So they might be waiting for maybe the battle for Lyman to end, so that they could have Russian troops stationed in Lyman, but also, in this forest here, so that they could then help the Russians cross along the river into the power station. That is my guess. Because then, Mykolaiv with Lyman is a very deadly combo, especially for Slovyansk. But right now, it seems like the Russians are just kind of clearing up their main kind of base in the southern part here near area, like Andreevka, just kind of clearing out these areas. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing Russian operations towards the town of Oravka here, just a small outpost on the way to Mykolaiivka here. And then down here near Konstantinovka, we had more geolocations confirming that the Russians are indeed operating in the northern bank here. They had Russians raising their flags here. Um, One thing I will say is that again, the Ukrainians will be doing these counterattacks probably periodically to try to establish either just to kind of say the Battle of Konstantinovka is still ongoing. But as we mentioned last time, the Russians won the Battle of Konstantinovka. And even though the Ukrainians can infiltrate maybe 5% of the city on the most northern outskirts, that doesn't mean And it does seem like the battle for here has slowed down. We haven't had any real progress, in closing this gap here, which is I think where the Russians are going to have to focus on clearing out this gap. Maybe they're doing that, but we haven't had any updates about what's happening in this northern gap yet. And it seems like maybe they're just doing rotations. They usually do that, so it just depends on are they going to return back for the summer? Are they going to try to push towards Alexandria-Skovka, or is this it? Are they like now that they taken Konstantinovka, they want to put the assault troops they put there and redeploy them somewhere else? Is that what's going to happen? So it's just a big question mark. Most sources are also saying Russians have strong control over Markova and Maisky here. Before a lot of people are trying to put this area in a gray zone, but it seems like the Russian push here has been more solid in control. I wouldn't be surprised if we're also starting to start seeing DRG activity towards Fedorivka and definitely towards Vera Lubovka, which the Russians will have to take to start doing their kind of encirclement of Alexandria Skovka from the north. But so far, it's getting kind of seems like the Russians are quiet here, so we'll have to see. Maybe in the next video we'll see how if the Russians continue, pushing this, or maybe they're gonna focus somewhere else. But yeah, that's the Fortress Belt area. Okay, now we're gonna go to the Dobropillya direction, and this week we actually had a very interesting update happening from Dobropillya. I think I mentioned this last week, but we had even Ukrainian sources are saying there was DRG activity happening. There was even they said a soldier infiltrated Dobropillya himself and like took his clothes off and became a civilian here, according to the Ukrainians. So, but a lot of mappers are saying that this kind of northern part, it seems like the Russians are been infiltrating this and kind of expanding their presence in this northern part of Dobropillya a little bit. Some Russian sources have been saying this for a while, but I think it's probably starting to become true that the town of Vilnia, this area right here, is not under Ukrainian control. I don't think anymore. I think this area, I think up, we have, maybe a Ukrainian presence definitely up here, maybe a little bit here, but I feel like Stepi and Vilna are like just these small little village huts that have been probably reduced to ruins because they've been on the front line for like a year now, and there's probably nothing. But I do think that the Russians are slowly but surely kind of pushing northwards a little bit, reaching, expanding the gray zone at the very least a little bit. And even Syriac shows that some of these fields have been taken by Russian forces. We also had another geolocation of the Russians trying to enter the northern part of Belitsky here. Looks like they're trying to move across through these tree lines. So I do think so the battle for Belitsky is still ongoing. I do think what the Syriac has here is definitely probably something around what's happening in the sense that the Ukrainians are able to reinforce Belitsky through their giant built-up areas in this mine shaft in Silftia and this mine shaft, and they're able to kind of feed this like high-rise building area and in the western part of Belitsky, but the Russians are able to infiltrate eastern part of Belitsky, and that's like more of a gray zone. Though I don't, the Ukrainians are holding on to Belitsky for dear life because it'll be a very great starting off point for the Russians to use Belitsky to then then move it to this quarry mine and then towards Chernivka, which they could then outflank Svitia. So Belitsky is kind of the key to all that. We shall see how that develops. Also, I think I mentioned this last week as well, so the Russians are awful. We had even Deep State, which is a pro-Ukrainian mapper, saying that there's infiltrations of Shevchenko. We shall see if that's just some DRG activity or is there something real going on here. Again, it's very hard to do this because behind, the Russians, they have Pokrovsk and Leningrad, but once you go beyond here and you want to start moving towards Dobropillya, as you can see, there's a lot of open space where the Ukrainians could use drones to stop you. And all these areas, these little villages are either have already been like kind of burnt up and all that. So it's very hard to go from like kind of your main defense line across to reach the Ukraine defenses around Dobropillya because of drones and all that. That's my guess why they select. They probably also just put a lot of assault troops away from Pokrovsk towards Konstantinovka. And my guess is that once you know, since they take Konstantinovka, they're not going to reroute them towards some other direction. Um, we shall see which way. Maybe they're going to move them towards Mykolaiivka. We've been seeing a lot of pushing in this area, so maybe they have redeployed them here. I wouldn't put it past them they're going to try to maybe just bull rush Kramatorsk and just try to hit them head on. You've seen them do that a lot of times. We saw them doing that with Pokrovsk even a little bit. Where they don't have to continuously encircle a city. They just do a little bit and then storm it directly. So we shall see. But yeah, so just it looks like the Russians are now kind of in this tug of war in the north of Pokrovsk, south of Dobropillya, in this Dobropillya area. It seems like the Russians are starting to get the upper hand, but without any sort of like, oh, the Russians have a strong presence at Belitska or this mine shaft. It's hard to say if this is something where the Ukrainians could do some sort of counterattack. But it seems like both sides have deprioritized this axis a little bit. So without any sort of strong like control, as it's been for basically almost the rest of 2026, this area is going to be between the Dobropillya suburbs and then Pokrovsk is going to be very fluid, I think. So we shall see if the Russians are able to get something tangible out of this. And then down here a little bit in Dobropillya, most mappers are saying that Mykolaiv, Moravka are still under Russian control. So this kind of battle between this rivers there, but also the Ukrainians are back in control of Novopavlovka, basically for the most part. And yeah, that's really the Dobropillya direction. Not much else. Nothing has really changed here in the last 2 weeks. Just a little bit. The Russians getting a little bit of an upper hand here, but still nothing concrete. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia direction, and this is actually again, this is one of the most complex areas. Let's talk about the Dnipropetrovsk area first of all. Kind of this area from Zelona High. This is where towards like the kind of the Zaporizhia area here. This is basically the biggest clusterfuck I've ever. We and just this giant gray zone. It's very hard to. This is like the hardest thing for mappers to tell which is what. We talked about the Ukraine counteroffensive here. We've had more and more updates on what's happening. That's what's happening here for the last 2 weeks and more. We had information coming in of the Russians. There was like a bunch. There was more updates of the Russians being here, but also there was a video of a Ukrainian assault group taking Russian prisoners in this village right here. We had Ukrainians raising their flags in Novohaska, and we even had a thing of Ukrainians trying to infiltrate Podunia, but then getting drone attacked. So it does show that, but also the fact that we had Russians trying to getting attacked and getting arrested, like getting taken prisoner in Irsika, but also then Ukraine, shows that, as I mentioned last week, this area between the Vochka River here and the Molka Yar River here, this area right here is a giant gray zone. I mean, you could extend that down here too. But it seems again is that kind of the Russians have kind of more strong control over this area, and then the Ukrainians are maybe around Zelona High and Andriivka Klitselovo. Is that maybe the Ukrainians are able to this is kind of but again, there's interlocking positions. I wouldn't be surprised there's still Russian positions in these two villages, while the Ukrainians could infiltrate Podunia if they wanted to, or Tolstoya. But maybe it's like one side has more control over the other. It's hard to tell because every day could change. And again, we're talking about groups of like 1 to 3 people. So it's a game of cat and mouse trying to find who's what. Things always change here, so it's always hard to keep in mind what's happening. So now the main but what and then also we've had more confirmation that Ivanovka has been retaken by the Ukrainians. We had the Ukrainians getting bombed in this area. They say the only thing the Russians have left is like kind of these forests here. And so this is the only bridge that they have over the Vochka River left. So if the Russians are still there, they could try to use it as a way to hold off the Ukrainians. But the thing is that there's no way to hold. Probably the same thing for these attacks here. I don't think there's actually really any Russians here anymore, and this is just like becoming a giant drone spot. Like Filia is just a small village of nothing, and yeah. So again, I think the whole reason why it's so hard here is because there's just so there's not like big, there's Kamar maybe, but like there's not really a big thing that they could use to like accumulate forces. It's just to reach Novopalovka or Ivanovka is just you just have a bunch of open fields and just so hard to actually move here. So I wouldn't be surprised if if it's just that once the Russians reached the Volga River, they just kind of like gave up. There's something that's we see here often is where both the Russians and Ukrainians they take something and then they for some reason they don't like guard it anymore. Like apparently, I wouldn't be surprised if large areas of the front are just unmanned or very very thinly manned. Anyway, um, in any case, lots of there's still not really a big, that's just some changes here. And then here, we talked about last week that the Russians, or last time I made this video, the Russians were raising their flags here. We haven't had any more updates in this area. The Ukrainians are claiming they retook all of Donetsk Oblast, but they didn't have. I mean, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, meaning like, oh, they retook Ternovo, Beresova, and so forth. But I don't think that they didn't produce any proof of that. They just show them bombing things. They didn't even show them like raising the flags here, which is something the Russians do. But again, a lot of the times it could have been like, oh, they entered the village. Like for example, I don't think there's Russian troops garrisoning Alexandrivka anymore. I think they were able to infiltrate them, and then they reach. I think the main Russian defense again lines between the Vishana Berezova line. I think that's like the main where that doesn't mean the Ukrainians can't infiltrate here into Kalinovska and and stuff, for example. But that I think that generally speaking, Russian control is generally more stable here, and that yes, the Russians can go up to the Volga River to Alexandrivka, and such, maybe even to Aristopol if they wanted to, and then the main Ukrainian defense lines on the other side of the ridge in Pokrovsky, in Velika Mikhailovka, and then they, send troops, and because these big centers of resistance are so close, they're able to then, you know, feed infiltration groups that are able to set up shop in Alexandriivka, in Nova, and in Oleksivka, and they are able to keep on going down towards, Vishana even and Berezova. So what I would say is that kind of the Vushka River is strong Ukrainian control, and then everything down to this area. I'm kind of overwriting here. Like everything below the Vuchka River and then up to Vashana and Berezova is the gray zone. They for example, I think Syriac has a lot more lower down as under so-called, where it's more of a gray zone. I do think that these areas in these fields, there's not like Russian soldiers hiding in these tree lines anymore, but I don't think there's like Ukrainians, especially since the offensive here has slowed down and actually has basically stopped. The Ukrainians are now just the offensive here has basically not has has petered out. So I don't think there's more Ukrainian troops infiltrating all the way deep here. Like if there was an active offensive operation, like there was in March, maybe there could have been inches of them like breaking through and getting to these fields here. But now that I think the offensive has stopped, I do think it's kind of settled around the Vashana Berezova line. Just from my read of the situation here. So, but again, there's not really been any changes the last 2 weeks. I'm just, we haven't got any information either way. In fact, the entire eastern grouping called Vostok, which kind of starts from the eastern part of Orekov all the way to Zelona High here, is has been really really slow this last 2 weeks. Hasn't really done much updates. We just got some more clarifications and such. So, um, and then yeah, as we talk about this area, and what's interesting here, for example, there's another map here that I want to bring up here called Divgen, which it's a Russian mapper, and as you can see with all Russian, and this is like their take on what's happening on the eastern side. So as you can see on this side, you can see that, like for example, in Syriac, we have Verka Teresa and Vozhemka, which is creating they have like a bridge at here. And but if you compare the, so we had geolocations of the Russians being in Lisny, Rivne, and Kopany, but again, these are kind of more of like DRG activities, and it's just a matter of like, well, how much of this is a gray zone? Now, if you look at in DivGen, for example, let me show you this guy. As I showed earlier, they have Rizadamka and Ternovat is a gray zone, but Rizadamka under Russian control. And so, as we see here, though, Syriac has Ternovat and Rizadamka as under Ukraine control. So again, I do think that this entire we haven't actually had that much more updates here, or any new updates. Now, basically, if you look at Russian positions, is that they claim that they're kind of like, they're slowly but surely moving across this area here, and that they're in control mostly of this area. They are stretching towards Lubelishka, Lisnya, Rivnia. Um, they're even in control of Ternovat and Ryazanka. But I think right now is that this entire there's like a Russian. They're trying to create a stronger Russian presence here, because I have no doubts that the Ukrainians could probably try to enter, Vozhdanka or Verka Tersa if they wanted to. It's just that they're not attacking here. They're mostly attacking in these two areas, as I was talking about earlier. So I mean, it's a big question though. I mean, if Divgen's right, then the Russians are, and are still, are very still fluid here. I do think this area is more of a gray zone. I do think the Russians can enter Ternovat and Rizadamka, but again, maybe maybe it's kind of like the same thing here, where maybe yes, like for example, Ukrainians could probably enter Vozhdanka and Rekutersa if they try to do assault units here, but maybe there's like it's mostly under Russian control. Maybe the same thing here. I don't know. I haven't actually had any more updates happening from the north here. I think we had a geolocation. The latest geolocation I saw was a Ukrainian getting bombed in this village between these two towns here. So it's just hard to know what exactly what. Again, this entire area is a big clusterfuck. So um, but we just it's just a matter of like again, the biggest news for the Russians is that they have a bridgehead on the other side of the river here, which is what was being fought over. And so, especially in this kind of southern area here. So if the Russians could expand from there, then they'll be in a good position. But I don't right again, the main goal here again for the Russians is to reach the town of Lubiskia, this like highway that leads the Omelette Highway, as I call it. They also need to have control over here. They'll just good, protect their flanks here, but push towards this area, and then they cut, the Omelette Highway, and then from here, they'll be able to then march down into Orekha from the north here, and and take it, and then the front line will go, something like this, which is the goal. And then they'll try to push northwards to have the front line go kind of like this here. That'll be what the main goal would be for the Russians in this area. Now, as we go towards more the eastern Zaporizhia direction, there's been some more clarifications. The biggest news is that there seems to be that this area between Sherbaki and Nova Andreevka is becoming more and more solidified under Russian control. Seems like the Russians are kind of putting up forces here. I don't know how much of this is just slowly taking some tree lines, and the Ukrainians are just getting kind of pushed back to the Orekha agglomeration. But it does seem like the Russian positions, at least in the Sherbaki to Nizhny area, is a bit more secure. So most mappers are kind of putting these fields in more under Russian control here. So that's good. But I wonder, like, and we also have been having geolocation of the Russians being in Malatopmacha, in Novodolivka, in Novandrivka, for example. I think we had a geolocation of them being in Novodolivka here, as an example. So it does show the Russians can infiltrate these areas, but again, it's very, very hard because since the Ukrainians have this giant built-up, area to just continue, sending troops here, it's easy for them to kick the Russians out. Whereas if the Russians, manage to latch on to these villages, it's very hard for them to move across open steppe country towards Orekha, for example. And then towards the eastern part, we had geolocation. We had the Russians are fighting we had geolocation of the Ukrainians being in the northern part of Plavny. But for example, we also had geolocation of the Russians being in the eastern part of Stepanur. So this kind of Stepanursk area is a big gray zone. It seems like the Ukrainian offensive here has stopped. So the Russians have stopped them from, like, say, breaking through towards Vasilivka. But so in terms of like protecting the front line, the Russians have stopped the pushing the offensive. But that doesn't mean that the offensive here, where the Ukrainians reversed a lot of Russian gains here, which would have, if the Russians could have helped, it would have helped uh, continue pushing down or encircling Orekov, it made the advance towards Orekov a lot harder, and I wouldn't be surprised that it takes them the rest of the year for the Russians to even take Orekov. I mean, the thing is, the Russian push in the Zaporizhia area has been completely slow to a crawl. But if I were, again, the main battles around Stepanhursk again, so the Russians could take Stepanhursk and just kind of use it as the main defense line. This will allow them to have forward operating positions to strike Ukrainians with drones here with all over this area. But I do think that we'll just see who gets out on top and all that. Alrighty. Now we're gonna go to the Lyman direction, and in the Lyman direction, we've had the battle from Lyman is still ongoing. However, there is some small changes, but just some things to talk about here. But again, it's like one of those big cluster things. Let's talk from the south upwards. So in the southern part, Yampil is under mostly, most Russian sources are saying that Yampil is under their control again, uh, and also that the towns of Dobrovin or Zhina are back in the gray zone. There's no Ukrainian presence here, but there's not. It's just really hard for the Russians to enter them. I do think these two villages have been probably razed to the ground. Uh, but again, the advanced here in Yampil, I do buy because I think that especially with the Ukrainians and a lot of maps are saying the Russian Ukrainians have fallen back to Star Caravan and kind of this area right here. And this makes sense because again, this kind of is linked with the Russian push in the southern part here in in their Kuraluvka and such. And so once Kuraluvka fell, it was just very hard for the Ukrainians to send troops to reinforce this area and try to infiltrate. Um, so I do think the Russians have reasserted control over Yampil, and I do think that but again, the reason why the Ukrainians are still able to hold on to this area is because again they still have Star Drubovka, they still have Mykolaievka, which they could use to infiltrate here. I talked about this in the beginning of this video, where the capture Lyman and pushing the Ukrainians on the other side of the river will allow them to start infiltrating Mykolaievka and such. So I do think that taking Kurluvka and such has allowed the Russians to reassert control over Yampil and push Dubrovnik or Zhina towards more under their control, but those probably still contested a little bit in the gray zone. In Lyman itself, again, I talked about this last week, but again, it's just basically the gray zone city, as I call it. It's just a giant gray zone. Um, but the main kind of main Ukraine like kind of solid areas is around the high-rise building area and the train station and kind of this more northwestern area, just because it's farthest away from Russian infiltrations and also it's the closest to where the Ukrainians could hold up and everything. In fact, some sources are saying kind of there's also some like there's like a humanitarian center around this area where the Ukrainians are trying to put the civilians to use this as a natural area to defend themselves from. So now, in terms of Russian infiltrations, a lot of Russians are saying, or a lot of again, this like Dacha area and this kind of southern part is under Russia, kind of where the Russians are accumulating. What I would find interesting is that I do think that maybe what the Russians are going to try to do is maybe move from high rise building to high rise building to accumulate forces here and then just try to continue pushing this way. This is probably why they put this zone as a gray zone and only this area is under Ukrainian controls, because maybe the Russians are battling for this area. So maybe that's what's happening here. They're trying to move through the high-rise buildings. Some areas on the most like kind of outskirts, these kind of areas are saying are under solid Russian control. I think it's just because that's like where the Russians enter, and then once they enter these areas, I don't know why they put these specifically. I mean, we had geolocation of the Russians being all over Liman, but I think I do think there is something to be said about maybe they infiltrate an area like the most outskirts of it, and then they use this to slowly bleed out. And so maybe these outskirts areas are like just kind of slowly. And then as you get closer towards the more bottom end of Liman, it's mostly under Ukraine control. That's why you have like this area being under Ukraine control or this area. And then maybe just slowly because it's like it's closer to where the Ukrainians are being supplied and everything. But I do think there's to actually enter Liman because everything is so deforested around it is that it's just very hard to actually push your way in, if that makes sense. So I do think that's what's happening there. But yeah, so the battle for Milan is still ongoing. I was kind of surprised, there was like a rapid collapse of Ukrainians here, but then the Russians never announced they took it. I do think that it's just it's just right now because of the Ukrainian offensive here in the north, which we'll talk about, and just also just it's just hard to actually take Lemont. But I do think the Russians will take it by the end of the summer campaign. Um, as I mentioned in the north here, the Russians. This is where the Russians are being a bit more pushed and stretching their resources. For example, we had a Ukrainian offensive here. Most mappers are now saying the main offensive is settling around the town of Novi. Um, which makes perfect sense. And again, the thing is that I don't think that because again, if the Ukrainians could kick the Russians out of this Novi area, then it's again there's just this yes, there's like some strong areas they've around Shedel, Kovo, Novoselivka. We had Russian sabotage groups being near Swetohersk. I do think they're probably also a lot of in control of Yarova. They're fighting for Dobropillya. So there's like a lot of areas they could have built up here. The thing is, they need a stable supply line, and when the Russians were like here, they were able to have like a connection to kind of the main Russian positions near the Zhirobets River here. But now that the Ukrainians are pushing here, it's just this entire northern sector is very much in trouble, and you need a strong northern sector to actually help your push on Liman here. Um, it just depends on how successful the Ukrainian offensive in the north of Liman is. It's centered on but if the Russians could hold on to Novi at least and then push them back to their previous front lines, then their northern sector could be secured. I do think kind of the main, right now the main defense is around this area right here. I don't think I think maybe there's DRG activity towards Korolyov or Alexandriivka or Swatohersk, maybe even in Yarvo Dorojeva, but I do think that this like circle is where the Russians are kind of holding out, and then they're not really. There's not like, oh, there's Russian troops in these tree lines, for example. I think how does Dibzhem do it? I'm kind of interested. I'm kind of interested in seeing what they have. Yeah, so this is their position, kind of the same thing. But yeah, it's a big question on because again, if the Ukrainians could take Novi, which is where the battle is ongoing, and again, I don't know how much of this is just like or have they reestablished control over Kharkov, or are they just like bypassing it to try to? Because again, one thing that both the Russians and Ukrainians do, they attack, and then if they do take back a village, right? They don't. A lot of times they don't garrison it. They just like they take it and then they like withdraw to more better positions if it's like a and so it's just very hard to know like how much of was this just like what's the exact positioning, because it's hard to know in this day and age. But anyway, um yeah, so that's Liman. Just and then also a lot of lower sources are saying Stavki is like a giant gray zone again, which is blows my because we have Ukraine's like and we I think we had geolocations like a month or two ago of the Ukrainians being around Stavki. So it does show that the Ukrainians also have, again, earlier when this was still being fought over, they were able to infiltrate the southern part of Liman and stuff. So if the Ukrainians have been doing counterattacks here towards Stavki and Liman, then it does show that, kind of the map showed Liman being encircled, but it does show that the thing was not as precarious as is shown here. So the defense of Liman for the Ukrainians is still ongoing. So, but again, it we'll see if because if the Russians could like if they could beat back this northern offensive and then continue their pushing here, then I do think they could consolidate in Lemon a bit better. But have to. I think they have to be back this offensive here. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Kupyansk direction. In the Kupyansk direction, the kind of also in the Kharkov area, the bridgehead again is completely we talked about how the bridgehead of the Ukrainian Kupyansk bridgehead was collapsing last video. This video, we this in the first 2 weeks of July here, we haven't really gotten more updates per se on what's happening. We've had most mappers are just kind of catching up. Now, one thing I found interesting on DivGen, which I don't know think I mentioned, but is a more of a pro-Russian mapper, Syriac's more neutral. But one thing about his area, what he has, which I think actually maybe might show it a bit better, is that the Russians have control over like Nova Solonia and Glushovka, for example. So if we come back to the Syriac map, they're in control of kind of the villages here, which makes sense. We did have geolocation, for example, of the Russians being in Nova Solonia and Glushovka about a month ago. But the reason why they have the southern part of Kupyansk Vozhnoye and the western part of Kisharovka which also Syriac has, as under Ukraine control, which makes sense because the main way the Ukrainians have been entering is through this area. And if you look at it, like for example, we have this kind of high-rise building area, and also in the southern part of the Kupyansk Vizhnoye, we also have a bunch of high-rise buildings. So we have this area which is like kind of like a very built-up area, and it's right up against the river. So Ukrainians could use kind of all these villages to then kind of accumulate to then cross the river to try to prop up the bridge hit here. And reason why they probably don't have this forest, which is on the other side, is because I don't think the Russians are entering this forest, but I do think it's a good thing to show that the Russians are probably just coming up and down these two villages here. At the very least, these two villages should be under Russian, or should be under a gray zone. Should be a gray zone at the very least, because I don't think there's like Ukrainians holding on to these villages. I think the main center of Ukraine resistance is southern part of Lyman and the western part of Kharkov. And I think, maybe you could say, I don't want to change colors, but yeah, like maybe there's like this other color or some shit. Actually, let's just go let's do this for whatever reason. Let's say this area is like more of like a gray zone because, maybe the Russians don't enter this forest because they don't feel like they have to, but maybe, but maybe this entire, these villages have been taken. So it just looks like Divgen says Nova Solonia and Gluzhovka have been taken, but like kind of this forest next to them is just, the Russians are just kind of sticking. Because again, these offensives are taking place with troops of 1 to 3 people. So there's not really that much of, how do you say it? Things happening there, for example. So, it's just what am I saying? Actually, it's there are things happening, but there's just like, they're just holding up to in these houses here. There's like, they don't really feel the need to go here. So that's why probably this forest has not been cleared by the Russians for whatever reason. And the Ukrainians are probably still holding out here, but they're holding out in their smallest back. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians clear out this pocket here very soon. Now, one big thing for the Russians once this pocket is cleared is that, I mean, they already taken the biggest part for it, but taking the rest of it will greatly help their offensive here. Is that they're also expanding their town in Kupyansk, or their bridgehead in Kupyansk. Uh, it's again, this is another area where it's kind of hard to know which neighborhood is which. Most mappers are saying kind of everything kind of the south here is under Ukraine control, and also in Morovia, which is kind of the northern part of Kupyansk. I'm kind of surprised they haven't taken that yet, but I do think it's probably because the main Russian kind of holdout was kind of this northern part here, and now that they've captured the eastern part of Kupyansk, they're going to be able to how do you say it actually be able to start supplying, because before this entire kind of area was under when the Russians were pushing, Kupiansk was under Ukrainian control, so that when the Ukrainians counterattacked, it was just very hard for the Russians to keep supplying. Now that the Russians have a stable connection on the other side of the bridge, their bridgehead in Kupiansk could be expanded. It seems like which is what they're doing here. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians just continue expanding their bridgehead. Now this is just my armchair general speaking, but if I was, I would try to create some sort of like kind of bridgehead like this. And that way you have a, big enough bridgehead where you have some space, and you have Kupiansk as the main logistics center. And then, the Ukrainians will have their next legit big kind of base around Shintanevko here. And so there'll be this giant gray zone, which I don't think either side will try to cross because of drones. But I think the biggest part of having this bridgehead not only is to kind of link up with what's happening in the Kharkov direction, which we'll talk about right now. Um, and the main thing here is that the Russians could then use Kupiansk as a springboard to to put troops on the other side of the Oska River, so they could then link up with the troops moving here, and then kind of take everything above this red line, for example. So above that red line in the Kharkov direction, kind of more like that area, is that we had the biggest news is that there's been this giant breakthrough towards Bilokolodasky here. And I always thought, because, I thought the Ukrainians would have, because this is the biggest town until Villa Barukli here, that, the Ukrainians will have a strong position here, and that, the Russians trying to move from, this built up area towards there's just too much open fields where they would just be attacked by FPV drones that the Ukrainians have set up in Bilokolodasky. But it seems like there's been some sort of big offensive here where, I haven't seen it actually personally, but a lot, even neutral mappers and some pro-Ukrainian mappers are kind of saying it too, is that there's been some sort of breakthrough, and even some pro-Russian mappers are saying that the first houses in Belgorod have been taken. I'm not sure yet. We have to keep an eye out, but there's some, before I thought, the Russians are just kind of moving around this area, and then these fields are just nobody lived there. I still think that's probably the case. I haven't seen the exact evidence showing the Russians in Belgorod, but if it is the case that they've been able to move down from Vachansk and, around these villages down to Belgorod and manage to push the Ukrainians out of here, I mean, that'd be very, very good news for the Russians. Because, Belgorod is the main hub of Ukrainian resistance in northern Kharkov, at least this part of northern Kharkov. And if if the Russians take it, then the Russians could then, use that to expand their push. They could meet up in Perlinovka and take this entire northern part of Kharkov, and then from here they could then start moving towards Villa Berukli here. But it could very well be possible the Russians take everything up to the north of this red line. If they do take Belgorod. But maybe that was a one-off fluke. Maybe that was DRG activity. Who knows? A bit more to the west here, we did have a episode of the Ukrainians being bombed in Harasovka. So I do think what's happening in the case here is that the Russians are basically, or the Ukrainians have positions in Rubizhnia, this giant forest, and they're able to cross this river, the Olska River or the Sovetski Donetsk River, and keep landing troops on the side. For some reason, the Russians aren't putting troops. Maybe they are. I don't know. But it seems like they're not like once they take a village, it seems like they don't want to like actually garrison it if it's not an important village or something. But I do think that the Russians not pushing, the Ukrainians are able to put forces here and then just, keep crossing the village. That's probably why I do think that the towns like Vilcha is under Russian control because it's just a lot harder to go to. Because I don't think it's not like the Ukrainians are moving from Belgorod here. It's that they're able to, and especially since, as you can see, this river is a bit more closer together here, narrow, is that they're able to use this area to attack and send troops over. So I think that's what we're seeing here, though I do think it's more of a gray zone than any solid control. But um, we had the Russians, as I think, as we mentioned. I don't know if we mentioned this last week, but they're claiming they took Lozovka, Ukrainska, Zlomoyar. But I do think there's like a small river that runs here. Let me kind of look down here for a second. Yeah, the Pilna River here. I don't. Is this even a river? Yeah. So I do think it kind of, maybe the Russians are entering the northern part, going up to the northern part of this river, and then just stopping. Maybe what they're trying to do is just kind of move along these villages towards Trunokovko here. So, but they're also, as you can see, they're moving down here. So we shall see. Has the battle for Belgorod beginning, or was that just DRG activity? We shall see. But yeah, I thought at first they just moved down along this like reservoir, but it seems like the Ukrainians could still hold up, put troops here and harass the line here a little bit, even if there's a river. So we shall see. Um, I don't know if I mentioned this, but also the Russians are pushing towards Petro-Ivanovka and Novovasilivka here. Again, I don't know if the Russians are actually in these established themselves, stabilized themselves here, but there's a river that divides them from, Ukrainian positions here. The main prize is Kolodizna here is the biggest town in this line of villages here, but the Russians will want to take this just to, because if they take this just will allow them another, kind of forward operating base to, expand their, how do you say, their border zone, their security zone. And then from here, they could then, maybe, use this to push, towards these line of villages here. Maybe, this way they could start trying to, move to cut off the logistics to the southern part of Villa Peruvka here, which could help with once the Russians start trying to reach Villa Peruvka from the north, they could try to encircle it because that'll be the main prize for this entire northeastern Kharkov direction, taking Villa Baruk and kind of reaching Primorska, kind of this area right here, these line of villages, before the Sovetski Donetsk River runs out, basically. Anyway, yeah, so that's happening in the Kharkov direction. Just lots of slowly the Russians are pushing out of Volchansk. They were kind of pushing toward, kind of clearing up this area, but now they're also pushing a bit more south, so we shall see how that expands. And then also a bit more to the west here, we have Kazashalopa. The battle for Kazashalopa is the Russians are not, battling for the center part of the of the town. The Russians have actually captured the central part of the town. Kazashalopa is actually divided in half by the river, the Lopan River here, and it's a way for the Russians to um uh and so, but on the eastern side of the river, the central part has been captured by the Russians. And in fact, yeah, and then Syria has shown the rest of this as a gray zone. But I do think the Russians are, just slowly but surely, consolidating themselves here. And I wouldn't be surprised if they, cross the river and start trying to take the west of this area here. Now, the big question is, what are they going to do after Kazachalopa? In terms of that question, there's a lot of areas. I think right now they're just trying to take Zachalopa as like kind of forward operating base. I mean, is this just an area to pin down Ukrainian forces? Um, is this because if they want, if this was just like a kind of like what I thought would be like an operation to for PR purposes where they take like a few like border villages which mean nothing, but they're just trying to like um show off their um, oh look, we took another village. They would have stopped at like Garanovka and Shenantivko, for example. But they continue pushing towards Kazashalopa. And so is this like part of an expanded offensive here? If it is, my guess is that, for example, we had another geolocation of the Russians being here. So, I thought, they would have stopped on the other side of this reservoir, which protects the Russian positions in this area of Kharkov. But maybe what they're trying to do is, maybe push to here. This would create, this could actually kind of link up with this part of the Kharkov security group, and then also, just kind of push, use these towns and villages as a to protect to put your forces in and such. Maybe they just stop at Kazashalopa and that's it. Um, but we shall see how that goes. But yeah, right now the central part of Kazachalopa has been taken, and right now I wouldn't be surprised. The Russians are gonna, I think soon the Russians will take something like this, and then only the most southern part will remain, and we shall see if the Russians expand from there. But yeah, it seems like they've broken the defense of the Kazachalopa, and now they're fighting for it, and we shall see how that develops in the next week or two. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Sumy direction. The main thing that's happening is the Russians are battling for the Kotatan, the second kind of defense line, the Kotatan line, named after this village right here. The main thing is the Russians are slowly but surely just, they've taken the eastern part of Perasovka. It seems like they crossed this kind of reservoir here and are trying to create a bridgehead on the other side of evil Zhansky here. The Russians have claimed they have actually captured this village even. We had a geolocation of the Russians being in Kondratevka, because it's kind of hard. We have actually we had other geolocation of the Russians kind of going down this highway here and getting bombed here. And so a lot of sources are saying that these fields, these tree lines to the south of Dnipropetrovsk have been taken by the Russians. So they have positions in Novosibirsk even. So and so this kind of second defense line is slowly being taken. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, take Novosibirsk soon and Perasovka. And then from here, they'll obviously push towards, as you can see, they're already trying to push towards Karapashivka and such. And again, the main goal here is to take Kota town here. So, take and then, expand into this kind of forest here, which could protect them from FPV drones. So, yeah, there's that happening. And then also the Russians have taken back Kondratevka. This was something they took, but got lost in the Ukrainian counteroffensive here in Sumy. But now they've been retaken, so it seems like the Russians are slowly but surely retaking their lost positions here. So Kondratevka has been retaken under Russian control. A bit more to the east here, we had the Russians are still holding on to the Pokrovka-Razny line, but there's been no changes kind of in this kind of Krasnopilya part of the Sumy direction here. And then if we talk about more of this area right here, the Russians have retaken the town or have taken the town of Bashet or Balsak or whatever the hell this is called. This is really good news for the Russians. But the thing is that I always wonder, like, how are they how are the troops getting there? Because there's no, as you can see, like, I wonder, like, how are the Russian, maybe there's like some field encampments or whatnot. Maybe there's like, I don't know. but it's kind of hard for me to like how do they replace forces here? But anyway, Balsac has been taken, and I do think that soon Toso Duva will probably be taken soon. And along with this, we had more geolocations coming from the south here, from to the north of Biloberza, activity of Russians in these fields to the north here. So, at first I thought all these villages around this area were just kind of taken for PR purpose, but it seems like maybe what they're trying to do, because if you look at the natural or like at the, kind of the pre-war Russian-Ukrainian border, as you can see, it kind of sticks out here. And so maybe what the Russians are trying to do is maybe, slice this down a little bit. It seems, Syriac actually kind of mapped this in, kind of like what they might want to take, which I think is actually kind of is a good example of what I think they might take, which is this area, because if they can take this area that's covered in blue by Syriac, it's like, that like flattens the front, is able to push the rush towards Glovovka, which, maybe if they take this, maybe they push towards Glovovka and, maybe they take that, who knows? But right now, it's just kind of, this might just be a distraction operation, but in any case, they're getting closer to the town of Ilanova. And again, the main, once they take Ilanova, I do think, right now they're just trying to slowly but surely, clear up this area, maybe start pushing, toward these villages here. But, if the Russians could take, everything behind this red line, that'd be, just kind of slowly pushing the Ukrainians out of um, the defenses here. So we shall see. But yeah, so Balsac has been taken. Probably next time I talk to you, maybe Ulanova will be taken. So we shall see. But yeah, that's the Sumy direction, and yeah. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed my weekly Russian-Ukraine War series. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.